someone climbed through a bedroom window and took an 8-year-old girl while she was sleeping. No one heard her. Not the family in the house. Not the neighbors on the street. By morning, the bed was empty. The window was open. And outside, in the grass below, investigators found blood. The girl's name was Kirsten Hatfield. She had been sleeping at a friend's house in Midwest City, Oklahoma. She was just 2 doors away from home. For 18 years, no one knew who had come through that window. Until a forgotten piece of evidence was finally tested and revealed that the person responsible had been living on that same street the entire time. 2 houses away. Tonight, on Cold Case Model, we are going to tell you everything. We are going to take you back to Midwest City, Oklahoma, in the summer of 1997, and walk you through the night Kirsten disappeared and the morning that followed it. We are going to follow the investigation through the years, the evidence that was collected, the leads that were pursued, the moment when the case went cold and what that coldness cost the people it left behind. We are going to talk about the science that eventually changed everything, about Cody's and the DNA revolution and what it means when technology finally catches up to an answer that has been sitting in storage for nearly 2 decades. And we are going to talk about the moment, 18 years after that morning, when someone sat down with a cold file and asked the question that broke the silence wide open. This is the full story of Kirsten Hatfield. And she deserves to have it told in full. Like this video right now if you think Kirsten's story deserves to be heard. Drop a comment below, tell us what brought you to Cold Case Model today. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a case. Every week we go deep into the evidence, the forensics, and the human truth behind the cold cases that refuse to stay buried. You are in the right place. Now let's keep going. To truly understand what happened to Kirsten Hatfield, you have to understand the world she lived in. Not just the street she lived on, not just the house 2 doors down where she spent the night, but the broader texture of the time and the place, the specific quality of life in Midwest City, Oklahoma, in the summer of 1997. Because that context is not background noise in this story. That context is the story. The ordinariness of that world is what gives this case its weight. And the weight is real. You feel it before you understand why you feel it, and then you understand. It is because what happened to Kirsten happened in a place where it was not supposed to be possible. And the gap between those 2 things, between the safety of the world she lived in and the horror of what came through her friend's bedroom window, is a gap that never fully closes, no matter how many times you examine it. Midwest City, Oklahoma. 1997. Try to feel it. Houses pressed close together on residential streets where everyone knew the names of the people next door and the names of the families 2 doors down and the names of the children who rode their bikes past on summer afternoons without anyone watching the clock. Front porches where people sat in the heat of the evening and waved to the neighbors walking past and talked across the yards about ordinary things. Screen doors and still summer nights and the sound of a television somewhere nearby drifting through the warm air. A neighborhood where the doors were left unlocked not out of carelessness but out of trust. Because the neighborhood had earned that trust. Because nothing had happened to revoke it. Because the world, in that particular place, at that particular time, had given everyone inside it every reason to believe that the children sleeping in the houses on that street were safe. Kirsten Hatfield was 8 years old. Let that number be a real number for a moment, not just a data point in a case file. 8. Think about what 8 years old actually feels like from the inside. Think about the way the world looks when you are 8, enormous and interesting and full of things that have not happened yet. Think about the specific quality of time at that age, the way a single summer afternoon can feel like it contains an entire world, the way a sleepover at a friend's house 2 doors down is not just a short walk from your front door but a genuine adventure, a departure from the ordinary, something worth staying up past bedtime for. Kirsten was right there in the middle of all of that. A child in the most complete sense of the word. A little girl who had a best friend and a warm summer in front of her and a whole life she was in the middle of beginning to live. The night it happened, the 2 girls had settled into the bedroom the way children settle into sleepovers. Talking too long past the point when they were supposed to be quiet. Giggling about things that would be impossible to reconstruct now. Slowly, reluctantly, finally drifting off into sleep, the kind of sleep that children fall into completely, the way crossing a threshold, one moment awake and the next moment utterly gone, deep in an unconsciousness so total that the world could shift around them and they would not stir. That is how Kirsten fell asleep that night. In a room that felt safe. In a house that felt safe. In a neighborhood that had always felt safe, on a street where nothing like this had ever happened before. And then, somewhere in those hours between midnight and morning, in that thick, warm, complete darkness of an Oklahoma summer night where the only sounds are the insects and the occasional passing car and the distant hum of a world at rest, someone came to that window. The window on the far side of the room. The window that was unlocked. We do not know the exact hour. We do not know, with all the investigation that eventually followed and all the forensic science that eventually spoke, precisely what happened inside that room. Whether Kirsten woke up before she was taken. Whether she heard the window moving and opened her eyes. Whether the face she saw, if she saw a face, was one she recognized from the street outside, from the neighborhood she walked through every day, or whether even in the familiar geography of that street the darkness made everything strange. Whether she understood what was happening. Whether she had time to be afraid. These are the questions that the investigation would carry for years. The questions that haunted everyone connected to the case. The questions that have no good answers and probably never will. What we know is what the evidence told. And the evidence told a clear and terrible story. The window was unlocked. That single unlocked window in a bedroom where 2 children were sleeping in the complete trust of childhood was the threshold, the crossing point, the boundary between before and after. The blood on the sill was the evidence of violence. Of struggle. Of something deeply, irreversibly wrong happening right there in that small space between inside and out. And there in the grass below, when the morning finally came and someone finally looked down, a child's torn underwear, soaked through with blood, lying in the yard in the pale and terrible early light of a Tuesday morning. The other little girl slept through it. Or she was too deep in sleep to register it. Or she woke up and there was nothing she could have done. We cannot know. What we know is that when she opened her eyes that morning and looked across the room at the bed beside her, it was empty. She would not yet have known what that emptiness meant. She would not yet have had the language for what she was looking at. But when Kirsten's mother came down that hallway, the hallway she had walked down 1,000 ordinary mornings, and turned the handle and pushed the bedroom door open expecting to see 2 little girls still tangled in the deep sleep of childhood, and instead saw one empty bed and a window sitting open on the far side of the room and something dark on the sill she could not immediately bring herself to name, she knew. Not because she had worked through the logic of it. She knew the way mothers know things, in that deep and pre-linguistic place where the body receives the truth before the mind is ready to let it in. She crossed the room. She looked at the window. She looked at the sill. She looked down at the grass below. And then she screamed. The kind of scream that carries through walls and windows and distances. The kind of scream the whole street would hear and understand immediately, without being told the details, that something had broken in the world that was not going to be fixed. The kind of scream that becomes, in the memory of everyone who heard it, the sound that divides before and after. Kirsten was gone. And somewhere in that same quiet neighborhood, 2 doors down, 2 houses away from where that mother was standing with her hands shaking and her voice broken open, the man who had done this was already moving through his morning. Already beginning another ordinary day. Already operating as though nothing had happened. As though a child had not been taken from a window in the night. As though he had not left behind blood and torn clothing and a family whose entire life had just been shattered. He was right there, 2 doors down, on the same street, going about the same kind of Tuesday morning that everyone else on that street was going about, except that he knew. He was the only person on that street, other than whatever small corner of Kirsten's consciousness had registered what was happening to her, who knew exactly what the empty bed in that bedroom meant. And he went about his day anyway. He would go about his day for the next 18 years. The investigation that followed was not careless. Let us be clear about that, because it matters. The law enforcement response to Kirsten's disappearance was immediate and serious and as thorough as the moment allowed. An 8-year-old child missing under violent circumstances in a residential neighborhood, this was not a slow response situation. Officers arrived quickly. The scene was secured. Investigators documented the window, the sill, the area around the house, the grass below. They collected the torn clothing. They photographed and bagged and logged everything with the kind of methodical care that a scene like that demands when you know, or should know, that what you are collecting might one day need to speak in a courtroom. The biological material, the blood on the sill, the traces on the clothing, was collected and preserved correctly. It went into labeled evidence bags. It went into storage. And it stayed there, intact and viable, for nearly 2 decades. The problem was never the collection. The problem was the moment in history the collection was made in. In 1997, forensic DNA analysis existed, but the infrastructure that would eventually turn it into the cold case-breaking tool we know today had not yet fully arrived. DNA had been used in American criminal cases for a decade by that point, and the science had advanced significantly since its early days. But what did not yet exist, what was still just 1 year away from being launched, was CODIS. The Combined DNA Index System. The national database that would change everything. In 1997, when Kirsten disappeared, investigators could collect biological evidence. They could preserve it. But they could not yet run it through a national database of known offender profiles and receive back a name, because that database did not yet exist. CODIS launched in 1998, 1 year after Kirsten was taken. 1 year. The cruelest kind of near miss. The technology that would eventually solve her case came into existence while the investigation into her disappearance was still in its early stages. And yet it would take years more before anyone applied it to the evidence sitting in that storage room. So the evidence sat. And investigators worked the case through everything else available to them. Interviews with everyone connected to the neighborhood. Canvassing. Building a picture of access and opportunity, of who knew the family, who knew the house, who knew the layout of that street well enough to approach a specific window in the dark without being seen. They worked the case seriously. They followed the leads they had. But the leads did not take them to a name. They did not produce an arrest. And without the technology that could have connected the biological material in that storage room to the person who left it there, the investigation gradually lost momentum. The weeks became months. The months became a year. The years accumulated in the way that years accumulate in cold cases, quietly, without ceremony, without anyone making a formal decision to stop. The case just went cold, the way cases go cold when the investigative energy has nowhere new to go and the answers are hiding somewhere no one yet has the tools to look. Kirsten was never found. Not her. Not her body. Nothing. She vanished from that bedroom window as completely as if she had stepped out of the world entirely. And for her family, for her mother especially, that particular incompleteness was its own particular kind of horror. Because grief with no body is grief with no architecture. There is no funeral that gives the loss a shape it can be held in. There is no grave to sit beside on the mornings when the weight of everything becomes too heavy to carry. There is no moment that functions as a door between the time before and the time after, between the grief and the living alongside the grief. There is only the not knowing. The relentless, grinding, permanent not knowing. That small and stubborn and impossible corner of the mind that cannot stop asking, what if? What if she is somewhere? What if she is still alive? What if the world contains your child and you simply cannot find your way to her? That is not a thought you can reason your way out of. It is a thought that lives in you. And Kirsten's mother lived with it every single day. Every morning. Every year that passed without an answer. While the neighborhood went on being a neighborhood. While the children on that street grew up and moved away and new families took their places and the houses changed colors and the trees grew taller and the street settled into a different version of itself with each passing year, losing its connection, slowly, inevitably, to the night that had once made it the center of everything. While all of that ordinary forward motion kept happening, the way it always keeps happening regardless of what has been left behind in its wake. And while all of that was going on, for 18 years, every day of those 18 years, the man who had come to that window was living 2 doors down. Going about his mornings. Walking past the same houses he had always walked past. Looking at the same street. Moving through the same neighborhood where he had done what he had done and apparently believing, apparently convinced, for 18 full years, that the darkness of that night would hold forever. That the evidence in that storage room would stay silent. That the answer sitting in that labeled bag would never be asked a question. He was wrong. But we need to understand why it took so long to prove it. If you are still watching at this point, drop a comment right now that says, "I'm still here." Let us see who is truly following this shocking story. And while you are down there, hit that like button and make sure you have subscribed to Cold Case Model. We are just getting to the part where 18 years of silence finally breaks wide open. The science of DNA analysis did not arrive fully formed. It was built, slowly and painstakingly, over the course of years, through the work of researchers and laboratory technicians and legal challenges and landmark cases and institutional decisions made by organizations like the FBI. And the single most important institutional decision in the history of cold case investigation, at least from the perspective of cases like Kirsten's, was the launch of CODIS in 1998. CODIS. The Combined DNA Index System. A national database of DNA profiles drawn from convicted offenders and from biological evidence collected at crime scenes across the country. A centralized, searchable, constantly growing system that law enforcement agencies in all 50 states could access and query. A system that meant, for the very first time, that a DNA profile extracted from evidence collected at a crime scene in a small Oklahoma city could be automatically compared against the genetic profiles of known offenders from anywhere in the country. A system that meant the passage of time was no longer only an enemy of cold case investigation, because every year that passed was also a year in which more profiles were added to the database, and the pool of potential matches grew deeper, and the probability of a hit on old evidence increased. Think about what CODIS meant for cases like Kirsten's. The evidence from that Midwest city bedroom window had been collected in 1997, 1 year before the database that could read it even existed. And then the database launched. And the evidence sat. And the years passed. 1 year became 5. 5 became 10. And the answer that could have been found was sitting in a labeled bag in a storage room while the database that held the key to it grew larger every single year. Codes meant that evidence collected before the database existed, or collected the same year it launched, as in Kirsten's case, could be processed at any point afterward and matched against every known offender profile in the system. It meant the answer sitting in that evidence bag did not have to stay silent forever, as long as someone was willing to pull the bag off the shelf and send it somewhere that knew how to listen. But here is the thing about codes that deserves to be said clearly and without qualification: the database changes nothing on its own. The database is a tool. And a tool only does what it is meant to do if someone picks it up and uses it. The potential that codes created for cold case resolution only becomes a reality if someone makes the decision to pull old evidence from storage, review what was collected and what was tested and what was never fully analyzed, and send that evidence to a lab. That is the step. The single, indispensable, irreducible human step. The decision to go back. The decision to sit with an old file and take it seriously. The decision to ask, about evidence that has been sitting in a storage room for nearly 2 decades, has this actually been tested? That decision requires resources. It requires funding for laboratory analysis, because even as the technology became faster and more reliable, it was never free. It requires institutional support, someone in a position of authority deciding that an 18-year-old cold case is worth spending the department's time and money on. It requires someone to resist the comfortable assumption that if the case went cold, the answers must be gone, because that assumption is wrong, and in cases like this one, it is devastatingly wrong. And it requires, perhaps most of all, a person. A specific human being who picks up the file and reads it and looks at the evidence log and feels the weight of what is at stake and refuses to put it back down. In the case of Kirsten Hatfield, that person took a long time to come. Too long. Far too long, if we are being honest about what those 18 years cost the people who spent them without answers. But eventually, they arrived. Eventually, a detective sat down with the case file that had grown thick with the weight of years. Eventually, someone read through the original reports from that Tuesday morning in 1997 and looked at the evidence log and looked at what had been collected and looked at what had never been analyzed and picked up the phone and asked the question. Has this evidence ever been tested? No. That answer, that single, devastating, entirely preventable no, was the moment the case began to move again after 18 years of stillness. The evidence was sent to the lab. A DNA profile was extracted from the biological material that had been sitting in that storage room since 1997, preserved correctly, viable, ready to speak after nearly 2 decades of silence. That profile was run through codes, through the national database, through the vast and growing archive of genetic information that the FBI had been building since 1998. And somewhere in that comparison, in that digital search through hundreds of thousands of profiles, there was a hit. A match. A name. A name that belonged to a man who lived 2 doors down from the house where Kirsten had been sleeping the night she disappeared. 2 doors down. On the same street. In the same neighborhood. 2 houses away. Let the geography of that settle fully, because it is one of the most disturbing elements of this entire case. This was not a stranger who had come from somewhere else. This was not an unknown figure who had passed through Midwest City and left no trace of himself except in the evidence bags on a shelf. This was a neighbor. Someone embedded in the community, in the daily life of that street, in the specific and intimate geography of those houses and those yards and those windows. Someone who knew which direction the bedroom window faced. Someone who knew which houses had children and how late the lights stayed on and what the yard looked like in the dark. Someone who, after doing what he did, walked home 2 doors down, and closed his own front door, and began the long, apparently confident project of going about his life as though none of it had happened. He had been right there the entire time. Walking that street. Living in that neighborhood. Breathing the same air as the family whose lives he had destroyed. For 18 years, he had lived alongside the consequences of what he did without being touched by them. While Kirsten's mother carried the not knowing through every season, through every year, through every morning that started and every day that ended without an answer, he was 2 doors down. Still there. Still going about his days. When detectives went to find him, following the name that had come back from the lab, he was not gone. He had not fled. He had not remade himself somewhere else. He was right there. Still in the area. Still apparently convinced that the evidence he had left behind on that windowsill and in that grass had said everything it was going to say. The arrest was made. And the science that spoke in that courtroom was the same science that had been waiting in a storage room for 18 years. DNA does not change. It does not forget or get confused or revise its conclusions based on how much time has passed or how ordinary the suspect's life has appeared in the years since the crime. It is what it is. And what it was, in this case, was proof. Proof that connected Christopher Bernard, the man who had lived 2 doors down, to the biological material collected from that bedroom window and that torn clothing in the grass on a Tuesday morning in 1997. 18 years of silence. Broken by a labeled evidence bag, a laboratory, a database, and one person's decision to ask a question. Now we have to talk about what a resolution actually means in a case like this. And we have to be honest about it, because Kirsten Hatfield deserves honesty more than she deserves a comfortable ending. The conviction is real. The justice is real. The accountability that finally came for the man who lived 2 doors down is real, and it matters, and it should have come sooner, far sooner, and the fact that it came at all is the direct result of the forensic science working exactly as it is supposed to work when someone finally gives it the chance to. But resolution is not the same as restoration. Justice is not the same as peace. A verdict does not give a mother back her daughter. It does not recover the 18 years that were spent without an answer. It does not provide a funeral or a grave or a moment of formal goodbye. It does not give back the 8 years of life that Kirsten lived, or the decades she should have lived after them. It does not make the not knowing into a knowing that is bearable, because the knowing that eventually came told a truth that brought with it its own new weight. Kirsten was never found. She was never brought home. And that absence, that specific, permanent, irreducible absence, is what sits at the heart of this case no matter how many times it is examined. Kirsten's mother got a name. She got the truth, or as much of the truth as evidence and science could deliver. She got justice. But she did not get Kirsten. That is what we have to hold when we hold this story. The science worked. The system eventually did what it was supposed to do. But the little girl who fell asleep in a friend's bedroom on a summer night in 1997, who believed with every fiber of her 8-year-old self that the world was safe, she did not get to live the life that was waiting for her on the other side of that night. And no resolution, however right and however hard one, changes that. What this case leaves us with, beyond the grief of it and the anger of it and the particular sorrow of 18 years lost, is a question that matters for every cold case that has ever gone cold and stayed cold while evidence sat untested in a storage room. The question of what it costs to wait. What it costs the families waiting for answers while the evidence that holds those answers sits on a shelf. What it costs the communities that lose faith in the possibility of justice when years turn into decades without resolution. And what it would cost, or rather, what it would gain, to make a systematic, funded, institutionalized commitment to testing old evidence. To sending old kits to labs. To sitting down with old files and asking the question, has this been tested? Because in the case of Kirsten Hatfield, the answer to that question was no. And the answer being no cost a family 18 years. There are families right now, in this country, in this moment, living the same perpetual not knowing that Kirsten's mother lived. There are cases sitting cold in filing cabinets and evidence rooms across the United States where the answer is in a labeled bag on a shelf waiting for someone to ask it a question. That is not an abstraction. That is the reality of cold case investigation in America. And the story of Kirsten Hatfield, the story of evidence collected properly in 1997 and left unexamined until 2015, is not an outlier. It is a pattern. And the pattern continues, in one form or another, right now. That is why we tell these stories. That is why we sit with the weight of them instead of skimming the surface. Because the people at the center of these cases lived through things that are far heavier than anything we could ever sit with for the length of a video. And the least we can do, the very least, is tell their stories fully and honestly and with the kind of attention that keeps their names in the world rather than letting them fade. Kirsten Hatfield. 8 years old. Midwest City, Oklahoma. 1997. A little girl who stayed up too late at a sleepover and fell asleep believing the world would hold still until morning. A mother who walked down a familiar hallway and opened a familiar door and had her world destroyed in a single moment. A neighborhood that heard a scream on a Tuesday morning and was never quite the same afterward. An investigation that did everything right with what it had, in a moment when what it had was not enough. An evidence bag that sat in a storage room for 18 years, intact and waiting and finally asked to speak. A name that came back from a database and attached itself to a man 2 doors down. A conviction. A resolution that is real and meaningful and 18 years too late and not the same as peace. This is the story of Kirsten Hatfield, told in full, the way she deserves to have it told. With every year of it. With every consequence of it. With the weight of it sitting exactly where it belongs. Cold cases do not have to stay cold forever. Not when the evidence is still there. Not when the science exists to speak to it. Not when there are people willing to pull a dusty file off a shelf and sit down with it and ask the questions it has been waiting for. And not when there are people willing to sit with stories like this one, to carry them forward, to say the names that are in danger of being forgotten, and to refuse, absolutely refuse, to let the world move on before the truth has been fully told. Kirsten Hatfield. Say her name. Share her story. Keep asking questions. Because cold cases do not go cold because the answers are gone. They go cold because the questions stop. And the moment someone starts asking again, the moment a detective, or a detective successor, or the person who inherits that detective's caseload years down the line, finally sits down with the file and picks up the phone and sends the evidence to a lab, everything can change. That is what happened here. That is the thing that broke 18 years of silence. And it is the thing that can break the silence in every cold case still waiting for someone to ask. Thank you for watching Cold Case Model. Thank you for staying with this story from the beginning to the end, for sitting with the weight of it, for refusing to look away from the parts that are hard to look at. Because that is what these cases ask of you. And the fact that you gave it, the fact that you are still here, means more than you know to the people whose names we keep speaking on this channel. We will see you next week. With another case. Another name. Another story that refuses to stay buried. Kirsten Hatfield. We will not forget her. If Kirsten Hatfield's name is going to stay with you after you close this screen, share this video. Share it so the world does not forget her. Subscribe to Cold Case Model if you haven't already. Turn on notifications. And leave a comment below telling us what you think justice really looks like in a case like this. We read every single one. We will see you next week, with another name, another case, another truth that refuses to stay buried. Like. Comment. Subscribe. Say her name. There is a particular quality to the silence that settles over a neighborhood after a child goes missing. It is not the silence of peace or rest. It is not the ordinary quiet of a residential street on a Tuesday morning, the kind of quiet that sounds like birds and the distant sound of traffic and life going about itself in its unremarkable way. It is a different kind of silence altogether. A silence that has been pressed into shape by something that should not have happened. A silence that every person on that street carries in their bodies even when they are talking, even when they are going about their days, even when the investigation is ongoing and there are police cars parked outside and investigators walking the perimeter of the yard and neighbors standing on their porches watching with that particular expression people have when they are trying to understand something that will not be understood. Every person on that street knew that something had come into their neighborhood and taken a child. Every person knew that the world they thought they lived in, the safe world, the trustworthy world, the world where you left the windows unlocked because there was no reason not to, was not exactly the world they had believed it to be. And that knowledge, once it is inside you, does not leave. It changes the quality of every subsequent morning. It changes the way you look at the houses on your street. It changes the way you hear sounds in the night. It changes the relationship between the inside of your home and the outside, between the space you feel safe in and the space beyond the window, in ways that are quiet and persistent and permanent. The neighborhood would go on. That is what neighborhoods do. The investigation would run its course. The police cars would eventually stop appearing on the street. The reporters who showed up in the days immediately after would move on to other stories. The neighbors would stop gathering on their porches to talk about it, not because they stopped thinking about it, but because there is only so long you can stand in the driveway talking about something terrible before you have to go back inside and make dinner and help your own children with their homework and live the life that goes on even when you would rather it paused. That is the strange and slightly shameful thing about life in the aftermath of tragedy, it insists on continuing. It does not ask whether you are ready. And for Kirsten's mother, that insistence of ordinary life continuing around her was its own particular cruelty. Because she was not ready. She would not be ready for a very long time. Perhaps she would never be fully ready. The world kept moving forward and she was standing in it, in the middle of a grief that had no shape because there was no body to give it a shape, in the middle of a not knowing that never resolved because the years kept passing and the case went cold and the answer stayed hidden and the man responsible stayed 2 doors down and went about his days as though the world owed him that ordinary life that he had no right to. The investigation continued in a formal sense. Cold cases remain open. There is always, theoretically, someone whose name is on the file, someone responsible for reviewing it if new information comes in. But the active investigation, the daily work, the follow-up interviews, the canvassing, that had run its course long before the years had accumulated into something as large as 18. The energy of the initial investigation dissipates over time. The investigators move to other cases, to the relentless present tense of law enforcement work, to the new crimes that demand new attention while the old crimes sit in their files waiting for something new to happen. That is not negligence. That is the reality of the workload. That is what it looks like when resources are finite and the past has to compete with the present for the attention of the people responsible for both. But the evidence does not dissipate. The evidence does not lose its energy or run out of patience or get distracted by other priorities. The evidence just waits. Correctly stored, properly labeled, perfectly preserved in its evidence bag in its storage room, the biological material from that Midwest city bedroom window waited with the perfect passivity of something that has no choice but to wait, and that will be exactly what it is whenever someone finally decides to ask. It waited through the 1990s. It waited through the launch of Cody's in 1998. It waited through the first decade of the 2000s. It waited while the technology that could read it became routine, became affordable, became the standard tool it is today in violent crime investigation. It waited while cases older than it, in other jurisdictions, were reopened and sent to labs and resolved. It waited in the specific darkness of its storage room for the specific moment when the specific person who would eventually pick it up and send it away finally sat down with the file. And when that moment came, everything that had been waiting came with it. There is a concept in forensic science and criminal investigation that does not get talked about enough in the public conversation about cold cases. It is the concept of evidence integrity. The idea that evidence, when collected and stored correctly from the beginning, does not degrade in its informational value even if decades pass before it is analyzed. The DNA in a biological sample does not become less the DNA that it is because it has been sitting in storage for 18 years. The genetic information encoded in that material, the specific sequence of base pairs that makes a person's DNA unique to them, that differentiates their genetic profile from every other human being on the planet, that information is preserved with the sample. It waits inside the sample, molecular and patient and unchanging, for as long as the sample is kept correctly. This is one of the most remarkable things about DNA evidence and one of the things that gives cold case investigation its particular and powerful quality of hope. Because it means that time, which in most areas of human experience is corrosive, which erodes memories and relationships and certainty and physical evidence of all kinds, does not erode the specific informational content of a DNA sample kept correctly in storage. It means that the gap between when evidence is collected and when it is analyzed is not a barrier to justice, as long as the evidence is still there and the database has grown large enough to contain the profile of the person who left it behind. It means that Kirsten Hatfield's case could be solved in 2015 because the evidence from 1997 was still exactly what it had always been. Still waiting. Still carrying the genetic signature of the man who had come to that window. Still capable of being extracted and sequenced and run through a database and matched to a name. The 18 years that had passed between the collection and the analysis were 18 years of silence, not 18 years of degradation. The evidence had been there the whole time, saying the same thing it had always been going to say, waiting for someone to finally listen. And that is the other thing worth saying here. The thing about the people who do this work. The detectives and investigators and forensic scientists and cold case units, the people who sit down with files from decades ago and treat them with the same seriousness and urgency they would bring to a case that happened yesterday. There is something particular about the kind of person who does this work. Something that resists the institutional pressure to treat old cases as finished just because they have gone cold. Something that refuses the comfortable assumption that if an investigation ran its course and produced no arrest, the answers must not exist. Something that looks at an evidence log from 18 years ago and sees not a closed chapter but an open question that has not yet been asked in the right way. We do not know the name of the detective who sat down with Kirsten's file. We do not know what moved them to pull it from wherever it had been sitting. We do not know whether it was a systematic cold case review, the kind that departments periodically undertake when resources allow, or whether it was a more personal and particular decision, a file that caught someone's attention, a name they had heard before, a conversation with a colleague, something that made them reach for this specific case from among all the cases that waited to be reopened. We do not know those details. What we know is what the decision produced. The evidence went to the lab. The profile came back. The name came back. And 18 years of silence became an answer that the biological material had been holding all along. We owe that detective something, even without knowing their name. The same way we owe something to everyone who refuses to accept that the past is finished. To every person who looks at a cold case file and sees not an archive but an ongoing obligation. To every investigator who picks up a phone and arranges for an old evidence bag to be sent somewhere that can speak to what it contains. These are not dramatic gestures. They are quiet ones. But they are the gestures that change everything. And they changed everything in the case of Kirsten Hatfield. The arrest did not make news the way the disappearance had. That is often how it goes with cold case resolutions. The crime is front page, the investigation is covered in the early days, and then as the weeks pass and the leads dry up and the story loses its forward momentum, the coverage fades. The case becomes a file. The file becomes a number. The number becomes part of a statistic about unsolved crimes in whatever jurisdiction was responsible for working it. And when the resolution comes, sometimes years or decades later, it is news again, but quieter news. The world has moved on from the original crime in ways that make the resolution feel slightly out of sync, like a message arriving long after the conversation it was meant for has ended. For the family, there is no such thing as being out of sync. For the family, the resolution arrives exactly when it arrives, and the question of whether the world still remembers enough of the original crime to care about the resolution is entirely beside the point. What matters is the name. What matters is the truth finally spoken. What matters is the moment when the years of not knowing collapse into knowing, and even if what is now known is terrible, is the confirmation of the worst things you feared, at least it is real. At least it is something that can be held in the hands instead of something that perpetually slips through them. Kirsten's mother had been holding the not knowing for 18 years. She got the knowing in the end. And the knowing was terrible and real, and the name attached to it was the name of a man who had lived 2 doors down and gone about his days for 18 years while she was living inside the grief he had created. That is what she got. That, and justice. Delayed, incomplete, unable to restore anything that had been taken, but real. The man who took her daughter from that window was identified, arrested, and held accountable. The science that made that possible had been waiting in a storage room since the morning of the disappearance. And the detective who finally asked the question that put the science in motion gave that family something that 18 years of silence had denied them. An answer. That is not nothing. That is not a small thing. An answer, even a terrible one, even one that arrives 18 years too late, is real. It is a door that was locked finally being opened. It is the unknown becoming known. It is the shape of grief, so long without architecture, finally receiving the thing it needs to begin to be held. A grief with no body and no name is a grief that cannot rest. A grief with a name, with a face, with an arrest, with a courtroom, with a verdict, is at least a grief that knows what it is grieving for. It is still grief. It is still the permanent absence of a daughter. But it is grief with an ending to the story, even if the ending is not the one anyone wanted. The case of Kirsten Hatfield matters for all the reasons we have spent this story on. It matters because of Kirsten herself, because her 8 years of life and the night they were taken from her deserve to be known and remembered. It matters because of her mother and every other family that has lived through the particular suffering of a disappearance without resolution. It matters because of what it tells us about forensic science and about Cody's and about what becomes possible when old evidence is finally given the chance to speak. And it matters because it is a mirror, an uncomfortable one, held up to a problem that continues right now. The problem of untested evidence. The problem of cold cases that stay cold not because the answers are gone but because the questions have stopped being asked. Every time a story like this is told, every time a name like Kirsten Hatfield is spoken in full, with all the weight of her years and her absence and her truth, it is a small act of resistance against the tendency to let old things stay old. Against the assumption that what is past is finished. Against the idea that the cold cases, the files in the storage rooms, the evidence in the labeled bags, that all of it is somehow less urgent than what is happening right now, in the present tense, in the new cases that are always demanding new attention. It is not less urgent. It is the same urgency, wearing the face of the past. And it deserves the same seriousness. The same resources. The same willingness to sit down with a file and ask what questions have not yet been asked and what evidence has not yet been given the chance to speak. That is what we believe here at Cold Case Model. That is the foundation this channel is built on. Every week, we come to these stories with that belief, that the past is not finished, that the evidence does not expire, that the names of the people whose cases went cold deserve to be spoken in full and with the full attention of everyone who hears them. We come to these stories because the people at the center of them deserve more than a summary. More than a headline. More than a case number in an archive. They deserve the full truth. They deserve someone who refuses to move on. Kirsten Hatfield was 8 years old. She was sleeping in a friend's bedroom 2 doors down the street on a warm summer night in Midwest City, Oklahoma, in 1997. She fell asleep the way children fall asleep, completely, trusting, without a single reason to be afraid. And someone came to the window. Say her name. Remember her story. And never stop asking the questions that cold cases are still waiting to answer. What we carry out of a story like this, the residue of it, the thing that stays after the screen goes dark and the day moves on, is the particular combination of grief and clarity that true crime, done properly, is supposed to produce. The grief is for Kirsten. For the 8 years she lived and the decades she did not get to live. For her mother and every morning her mother has woken up in the years since that Tuesday in 1997. For the other little girl who was in that bed and woke up that morning to an absence she would spend her entire life trying to make sense of. For the neighborhood that heard a scream and was never quite the same. For every family, in every city and town across this country, that is living right now in the same perpetual not knowing that Kirsten's family lived in for 18 years. The clarity is this: cold cases do not go cold because justice is impossible. They go cold because justice is hard and resources are finite and the present is always demanding more attention than the past is able to compete for. But impossibility and difficulty are not the same thing. And the story of Kirsten Hatfield, the story of an evidence bag that sat in a storage room for 18 years and then, when someone finally sent it to a lab, produced a DNA profile that matched the man who lived 2 doors down, is the clearest possible proof that difficulty is not impossibility. That the past does not run out of truth just because it has grown old. That the evidence does not give up just because the investigation did. There are people who tell stories like this one as if the resolution is the whole point. As if the arc from crime to conviction is a narrative that, once completed, has done its work. We do not think that. We think the resolution is important, enormously, significantly important, and we think it matters that the man who took Kirsten from that window was eventually identified and arrested and held accountable. But we do not think the resolution is the whole point. We think the whole point is Kirsten. 8 years old, Midwest City, Oklahoma, 1997. That is the whole point. The rest of the story, the investigation, the cold case years, the evidence in storage, the Cody's match, the arrest, the conviction, all of that is what happened to her story after she was gone. The point is that she was here. She existed. She had a name and a mother and a best friend 2 doors down and a summer stretching ahead of her on a Tuesday night when she went to sleep and trusted the world. We owe it to her to say that. Clearly, and without the kind of procedural distance that can make victims feel like props in the story of their own disappearance. Kirsten Hatfield was not a case. She was a child. And every time we say her name, every time we tell her story, every time someone watches this video and sits with the weight of what happened to her, that is a small act of keeping her in the world. A small refusal to let her be reduced to a statistic or a case number or an example of what forensic technology can accomplish when it is finally given the chance. She was a child. She deserved better. And the world, in the form of one detective and one evidence bag and one decision to finally ask the question, gave her, 18 years too late, the best thing it could still give her. The truth. Let us also be honest, here at the end, about something that is easy to gloss over in the narrative satisfaction of a cold case resolved. The man who lived 2 doors down got 18 years. 18 years of ordinary mornings. 18 years of walking that street. 18 years of going about his life in the neighborhood where he had done the thing he did. While Kirsten's mother was living inside grief without architecture, without an ending, without even a grave. While the other little girl was growing up with a memory she could not fully understand. While the neighborhood slowly healed around a wound that the healed surface only partially hid. Those 18 years cannot be given back. The cost of them cannot be recovered. And the lesson of them, the lesson about what happens when evidence sits untested in a storage room while a family waits and a perpetrator goes free, is a lesson that should be applied not as a retrospective critique of the investigators who worked this case with everything they had in 1997, but as a forward-facing commitment. A commitment to testing old evidence. A commitment to cold case review. A commitment to the understanding that every year a case stays cold is a year that costs someone something they cannot get back. That commitment is the work. That is what the people doing this work, the detectives, the forensic scientists, the cold case units, the advocates, the family members who refuse to stop asking, and yes, the people who tell these stories and keep these names in the world. That is what all of us who care about this are working toward. A world where the evidence does not wait 18 years before someone asks it to speak. A world where the question, has this been tested? Gets asked before the years become a decade and the decade becomes nearly 2. A world where Kirsten Hatfield gets her answer in 2005 instead of 2015. A few years sooner. A decade sooner. Any time before the evidence had spent nearly 2 decades in a storage room. We are not in that world yet. But every time a cold case unit is funded and a backlog of untested kits is cleared and an old evidence bag is sent to a lab and a name comes back from a database, we are a step closer to it. That is why this work matters. That is why these stories matter. That is why Kirsten Hatfield's name matters, spoken in full, with all the years of her absence and all the weight of her truth. Cold case model exists because of cases like this one. Because of the families who are still waiting. Because of the evidence that is still sitting in storage rooms across this country, waiting to be asked the right question by the right person at the right moment. We tell these stories because the telling is how the names stay alive. And the names staying alive is how the pressure stays on. And the pressure staying on is how the questions keep getting asked. And the questions keep getting asked until the cases stop being cold. That is the work. And we are grateful, genuinely, deeply grateful, that you are here to do it with us. There are 8-year-olds growing up right now in neighborhoods that feel safe. In houses where the windows are unlocked because there is no reason to lock them. In bedrooms where they fall asleep at sleepovers, giggling past bedtime, trusting the world completely and without reservation because the world has not yet given them a reason not to. And we want the world they live in to be the world it appears to be. We want the trust they sleep inside to be warranted. We want to live in the kind of world where an 8-year-old girl can fall asleep 2 doors down from her own house and wake up in the morning to the ordinary continuation of her ordinary, extraordinary, unrepeatable life. That is the world we want. And cold case investigation, the real work of it, the difficult, unglamorous, resource-intensive, evidence-driven, year-spanning work of it, is one of the ways we build it. Not by making the past safe retroactively. Not by recovering what has already been lost. But by refusing to let the past become a place where people who did terrible things can hide indefinitely. By insisting that the evidence will eventually speak. By asking the questions that need to be asked, no matter how long they have been waiting. Kirsten Hatfield. 8 years old. Midwest City, Oklahoma. 1997. She deserved a long life. She deserved to be here right now, middle-aged, maybe telling her own children about the summer she was 8 and had a best friend 2 doors down and went on a sleepover and stayed up way too late and fell asleep in a bedroom that smelled like summer and dreamed the easy, formless dreams of children who do not yet know what the world is capable of. She deserved that life. She did not get it. But she got the truth. And she gets this, the refusal to be forgotten. The insistence of people who never knew her, who were not on that street that morning, who heard her name for the first time in a video or a podcast or a news story years after the fact, the insistence of all of us who carry her name forward that she will not become just a cold case that eventually got solved and filed away. She will be remembered as Kirsten Hatfield. A child. A daughter. A best friend. A little girl who fell asleep trusting the world and deserved to wake up to it. We will be back next week. Same channel. Another name. Another case. Another story that refuses to stay cold. Until then, like, comment, subscribe to Cold Case Model. Turn on your notifications. And say her name. Kirsten Hatfield.